welcome to this No2Nato meeting on the anniversary of the Al-Aqsa flood operation when Palestinian resistance fighters broke out of the Gaza prison camp. I'm Chris Williamson, and I'll be chairing this evening's meeting. Now, we've got three outstanding speakers tonight. First up is the fantastic Irish comedian, actor, writer and musician, Tadgh Hickey. Tadgh's been a powerful voice for the Palestinian people and a trenchant critic of the Zionist regime. Next up will be the British-Palestinian journalist and political analyst, Sameh Habeeb. Sameh was born in Gaza, has previously reported on the ground from Gaza, and he's had first-hand experience of the brutality of Israel's occupation forces. Our final speaker will be the celebrated hip-hop artist and presenter on Mint Press News, Lowkey. Lowkey is one of the UK's foremost advocates of the Palestinian cause. Now, the response of the political class and the commentary by the corporate media to the events that unfolded on October the 7th last year has been nothing short of shameful. Both have routinely recycled Zionist propaganda about what happened and told barefaced lies to justify supporting a year-long genocide. The general election in Britain has made no difference to the diplomatic cover being given to Israel while it commits daily war crimes. Britain is still selling weapons to the Zionist entity to kill and maim Palestinians. And British citizens are still being allowed to fly out to participate in the genocide and then return home again with impunity. And anti-terrorist legislation is being used to intimidate and close down journalists and campaigners who dare to challenge the establishment's pro-Israel narrative. But despite the best endeavours of the Israel lobby and their supporters in Parliament and their stenographers in the corporate media, they've failed to convince the general public. Support for Palestine and opposition to Israel is at an all-time high amongst the general public. And the Zionist entity's economy is in meltdown. Last December, the Israel Population and Immigration Authority reported that 500,000 Israelis had already left the Zionist colony within 2 months of October the 7th. And that figure's only increased in 2024. The combination of labour shortages and the Red Sea blockade being imposed by Ansar Allah has already forced at least 46,000 businesses in Israel to close. And the Times of Israel reported on the 18th of July that Business Data Israel said that figure will increase to 60,000 by the end of the year. Now, just a quick word about Ansar Allah's blockade against Israeli ships and any others going to or coming from Israel. This is in compliance with international law. The 2005 World Summit placed an obligation on the international community to intervene when a state is, and I quote, manifestly failing to protect its populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. In other words, everything that Israel is guilty of. And this obligation is known as the responsibility to protect, often referred to as R2P. But rather than joining Ansar Allah in implementing the R2P obligation, Britain and the United States have bombed them instead. However, this has failed to dent Ansar Allah's resolve, and the blockade remains in place. And now that Israel's opened another front against Hezbollah in Lebanon, all of its ports could soon be inoperative, notably Haifa. The port of Eilat has already declared bankruptcy in July. So despite the shameful collaboration with Israel by the West politicians, the Zionist entity could be on the brink of collapse. International public opinion has moved decisively against Israel despite the cover it's been given by the political class and the media. So our task is to maintain the pressure on our useless politicians and expose the lies consistently peddled by the corporate media. And that's what we intend to do tonight. So let me invite our first speaker, Tadgh Hickey, to open the proceedings.
Thanks a million, Chris. It's an honour to be here. Yeah, I suppose just from the very outset in October, we had that sense straight away of, I think Claire Daly, the Irish politician who we're very proud of here, described it wonderfully as, you know, Palestinians die, but Israelis are killed. We hear the names of Israelis. Their names are constantly told to us when we're talking about hostages or the Israelis who have been killed. Palestinians are just statistics. And I was lucky enough to be in Qatar in last December at Al Jazeera, and many of their journalists did a deep dive on CNN and BBC, and they actually gave us a presentation of the sometimes subtle and sometimes not so subtle ways that the mainstream media here in the West will report on the so-called conflict. And it's, as I say, it's that type of thing where it seems like only one group of people are capable of being victims. And Palestinians are always treated with that kind of degree of suspicion that they are somehow involved in, terrorism. And I think from there on in, I imagine that, probably being naive, that, it felt like the world or the reasonable person was onto this complete media bias, this complete craven corporate uh, abdication of responsibilities, really, because it's journalism not being done. As the great Julian Assange has pointed out, it's the media not doing its job is directly responsible for at least the last 50 years of war on Earth. And you would imagine that if Al Jazeera are calling it out and everyone with a mobile phone can see that the media is not portraying things in a reasonable way whatsoever, is complicit, and we'll hopefully come back to this towards the end, is actually complicit in manufacturing consent for a genocide, that they would start to cut it out. But actually, the opposite happened. It feels like with every passing month, the propaganda from these mainstream media outlets continues right up until today. So I found myself doing a little bit of research earlier on, knowing that I was going to be speaking to you guys. And there's a headline in The Guardian today, literally today, which says Benjamin Netanyahu considering mass clearance of northern Gaza. Now, this is the so-called paper. As an Irish person, we would always look to The Guardian as the one that we could maybe think was somewhat reasonable, maybe left-leaning. And it is manufacturing consent for ethnic cleansing today. It's just absolutely extraordinary to me that they will still be so craven, that they're obviously under so much pressure from corporate interests, that they will persist with this dehumanizing of Palestinian life. And again, I repeat it, an attempt to manufacture consent. I have to say, where I'm hopeful is when I listen to the likes of Craig Mockiber, the human rights lawyer, who has stated several times in an article and in interviews that he has done, that there is an opportunity here to pursue maybe bringing these media outlets to justice, that they are directly complicit. I think he talks about there being 3 pillars, and these 3 pillars being necessary for genocide to happen. Obviously, we have the IDF and the Israeli government. Then you have the Western backers, namely the UK, the US, particularly the US. And then the 3rd pillar being media complicity. And without that vital 3rd pillar, you kind of almost can't have the other 2 running functionally. So I dream of a situation where these knowing peddlers of conspiracy theories and lies and propaganda will see justice at some point. It was after the fact that I think most of us learned the extent to which the media was complicit in the invasion of Iraq. This time round, we're all completely aware of the complicity every day, it being the first live streamed genocide that the world has ever seen. So I think we have to make sure that we step up our efforts to put pressure on government, but also where possible to make sure that these companies are hurt directly. Where it hurts them directly is obviously their bottom line. That we should be boycotting them, that they would feel the full force of an economic boycott, but also where possible, if they can be tried for complicity in genocide, I think that would only be right and fair, because it's not like they're reporting from some sort of place of not knowing. This is the Zionist regime has always been propped up by media lies. That's the nature of a settler colonial project. You need to ethnically cleanse, you need to destroy the indigenous population, and then you need to lie about it. And you can't do that without the media. So I think we can also take a lot from the Irish example. And I think I'm obviously biased there being Irish, but, we dealt with all this stuff, not so long ago as well. So that's why we're very familiar with it, and our kind of heads, our ears prick up when we hear this type of manufacturing consent. During the Troubles in the North, for instance, as just one example of many, there was an attempt in the British media at the time to try and frame the conflict in the North as a religious conflict. They were actually open enough to acknowledging that, say, for instance, Algeria was an anti-imperialist conflict because that was a little bit further away and it was the French who had done the damage. But when it came to the British elite media class, they tried to frame what was happening in the North as just kind of crazy Irish from two sides of the religious divide battering each other, and there was nothing really we could do about it. Sadly, the Southern Irish media was towing that line a lot of the time as well. And we now know, and people who were interested at the time knew, that actually what was going on was that it was an anti-colonial struggle and that it had little or nothing to do with religion at all. So those of us who are still awake, those of us who still care, I think we need to make sure that we're supporting each other to call this media complicity out wherever we can and as strongly as we can. And as I say, going forward, the dream is that these people will see justice, just as the war criminals in Israel and the US. I hope, I pray, and I actually believe as well, because I'm an optimist, will see justice one day. I think we owe it to our Palestinian brothers and sisters to ensure that we keep fighting, though they do try to silence us. And not just the mainstream media, we now get it as well with social media, who are constantly trying to silence us. I myself am experiencing this almost on a daily basis, but it doesn't in any way dull my passion for the fight. We keep going and keep finding new avenues.
Well, thanks very much indeed, Tadgh, and we really do appreciate everything that you've been doing to support the Palestinian cause. I was struck when I've been in Ireland and had a trip down the Falls Road to see the number of murals in support of the Palestinian people. And it's great to see the level of political awareness, I think, amongst the Irish, and the support amongst the general public for justice for Palestine and hostility towards Israel. And I've seen some of your politicians really giving the Israeli ambassador a really tough time. If only we had some politicians like that in Britain, it would be wonderful to see. But what do you put that down to, Tadgh? The fact that the Irish do seem more engaged, and indeed their politicians seem more willing to speak out and in support of justice in a way in which we could only, at the moment, with the political class we have in Britain, only dream about. What is it about the Irish, do you think, that sort of singles them out?
Well, I mean, I would have lots to complain about in terms of the Southern Irish media and political class, but I still take your compliments. I readily take them there about Ireland, because I do think we are a little bit of a cut above. And what has happened recently with Palestine, I think, is that it has made us reconsider and get back in touch with our colonial past. At the end of the day, an Irish person aware of where we've come from, the colonial past, the dehumanization, the being labeled as terrorists, we have so much more in common with Palestinians than we do with French, British, or German. The colonial experience is in our DNA and it's in our bones. So that's what you see in Belfast, which is, as you say, the perfect example of it, that the type of Irish republicanism that I've always been attracted to, it's never been narrow. It's never been, we need to get the British out and then we'll have our own little ethno-national Irish kind of state here and we'll do our own thing and play our own ancient games. It's always been outward and forward looking. It's always been internationalist. So as long as I'm reading Irish Republicans and spending time with them, I have always been aware of Cuba, South Africa, Palestine, and oppressed peoples around the world. So I just feel like Gaza has changed the world. The last year has changed the world forever. And I think I'm really glad to say that in Ireland, people who might have been on the fence and were maybe pursuing a more Western, capitalist, individualist kind of lifestyle or ideology have had their minds focused on the fact that, no, we Irish, we've always been on the side of the oppressed and we need to stand up and be counted now. I think we're unusual insofar as the European experience goes, as very few European countries can have any real sense of empathy and understanding of what's going on in Palestine right now. So that's why we need to take a lead. And that's why here We're pushing for a thing called the Occupied Territories Bill to be enacted, which would criminalise trade with occupied territories, not just in Palestine, but around the world. And we're hoping to get that bill passed in the foreseeable future. So Ireland needs to take the lead, because we get it, we understand, Chris.
The British political class are going in the opposite direction, and they're trying to, outlaw the boycott, divestment, and sanctions initiative. But I think the ability of the politicians and the stenographers in the corporate media, their ability to influence public opinion has been virtually eliminated, I think, in many ways, because of the advent of social media, which is, it's not perfect, it's a blessing and a curse, but and the emergence of new independent platforms. I mean, George Galloway, for example, obviously involved in No2Nato, leader of the Workers' Party, has a huge platform with the mother of all talk shows, the Moats program. But there are many other smaller ones with, maybe not quite as many viewers that George has, who are actually spreading the truth. And so the ability of the corporate media to lead people by the nose in a particular direction has really been almost eliminated now. And that's why I think maybe the general public are perhaps catching up with Ireland and really around the world. The politicians are so out of touch with where the people are. Now, I think, public opinion, I don't know whether you agree with this, Tadgh, but seems to have moved decisively now in support of the Palestinian people and totally against Israel and everything that it stands for.
Absolutely. Everything that you just said, I agree with. And I have two comments to make on it. Because on the one side, even though you're correct, it's bizarre that there hasn't been more changes on the ground. And that's a frustrating thing that, as you say, it feels like the ordinary person who has access to a smartphone knows that what CNN and BBC are telling them is bullshit. So that's a fact, right? So it's almost like the social media is correcting the propaganda as you go. So you would imagine then it would have a more dramatic effect on stopping this genocide. That hasn't been the case. So that goes to show how powerful the really powerful are, like the elite who control things, the corporate moguls, that they still have that level of control. But this is the second point. I think where you're so right is that in the future, all these young people, I mean, I don't meet anyone in Ireland, and it's not saying there's loads of older people that are supportive of Palestine too, but I haven't met anybody under the age of 30 who isn't supportive in some sense for Palestine. We're getting like weekly marches, thousands and thousands of people, events on all the time. And if that's Ireland, I know that's obviously we're, seen as a pro-Palestine country, but you're seeing it all over Europe. You're seeing marches. I mean, London marches are incredible to watch. I've been invited to marches in Manchester, and it's up and down Europe, and it's obviously happening in the States as well. And I think all those young people, the politicians, are going to be looking for their votes the next time round.
Yes.
And it feels like the kind of that colossus, of the Zionism myth, I think, has been broken forever. So the long-term effects of the propaganda being upended, I think, is that I am also, like you, hopeful that I just can't see how Israel and Zionism in its current racist, insular state can actually exist going forward. And I think that's right and proper that it doesn't exist. I mean, not to say Israeli people can't rip it up and start again and learn to try and live in some sort of coexistence in the region. But as it stands, that fascist apartheid state has to go and something new has to emerge. And I hope that young people who have been, I would say, rationalized, some people say radicalized by what's gone on the last year, will take that lead, particularly Jewish kids in America. I think, personally, I think they hold the key.
Yes, no, indeed. What we need to do, I think, is get our act together politically, because clearly there's huge support for the Palestinian cause, and I think actually huge opposition to the kind of economic direction that the political class have taken us in Britain and across Europe, and indeed in the United States as well. And the Labour, we've just had a general election, as you know, Tadgh, in the UK, and Labour has won a landslide majority with less than 20% of the overall number of voters supporting them, and that's a failing, really, I think, on on us, really, in terms of getting our political act together. And we need to do better than that, I think, the next election. So thanks very much indeed, Tadgh, for joining us this evening. Obviously, you'll stick around for a bit longer, I'm sure, and maybe we'll continue the discussion a little bit after we've heard from our next speaker, Sameh Habeeb. Sameh, in fact, was a candidate in the general election, but as I was saying in the introduction, Sameh is a British Palestinian journalist and somebody who was born in Gaza and, as I said, has experienced firsthand the brutality of the Israeli occupation forces. So we're absolutely delighted and privileged to have you join us this evening, Sameh. Thank you for taking the time out.
Well, I studied media bias. And I focused on the BBC. I focused on both, I would say, the liberal and the conservatives media. When it comes to Israel, Palestine, there's nothing as such as, liberal or conservative media. They are all pro-Israeli. There is massive bias to the Israeli narrative. There's a total blackout and negligence to the Palestinian narrative. And maybe you've seen the box of Gregory File from Glasgow University Media Group, Bad News and More Bad News from Israel, where they clearly give examples of bias through the First Intifada, where British media is totally adopting the Israel narrative and ignoring the Palestinian narratives. And if we look on the manufacturing of content, what was briefly mentioned, manufacturing content with your guest, it's very clearly there are many elements here to examine why there's media bias in the UK, which is the ownership is one bit, the flack factor in another bit, and also the ideological bias. But looking at, on the UK media in general, there are many reasons for bias, and one of the key reasons that I witnessed or have experienced here throughout my work is bias generated from the pressure of the Israel lobby through flack. Yes, there is bias by ideology, which is, I think, a small number of journalists have this ideological bias towards Israel. Thus, this bias is reflected on their coverage. What I see is bias because of this constant pressure from the Israel lobby. There are dozens of Israeli lobby organizations based in Tel Aviv, and they are, in my view, fronts for the Israeli intelligence, the Mossad. You're talking about the BBC Watch, you're talking about Honest Reporting, you're talking about Palestinian, this Media Watch group, and many other groups, all created to ensure there's a pro-Israeli narrative. And how they do it? They keep pressuring us, the editors, they keep complaining all the time that there is bias, although there is no bias. And that's one way, all the journalists or some of them would be held hostage to this, attacks, fearing that their names would be destroyed. As such, we have this bias. In my view, those journalists are careerists. You have a small number of journalists would dare to say the truth. Maybe the senior journalists, junior journalists wouldn't really dare to say the truth because of their career in the future, given that they have new jobs, etc. And the types of bias, it's endless here. It's bias by omission, by commission, content. These media standards that they were put, let's say, by the Ipsos or the Ofcom, both for the print or visual on audio outlets, are not adhered by. And I many times made complaints to the Ipsos on some articles. They would take you 4 or 5 months to reply to you, and at the end of the day, they will adopt the Israeli side of the story. Sadly, this is the state of the media. There is nothing as such, in my view, here as independent media in terms of editorial policies. The ownership would always dictate, the narrative and the editorial lines. And looking at the BBC itself, which was at the heart of my PhD, which I didn't continue because I had a clash with my professors. I was adamant that the BBC was never independent, and even the coverage of the BBC was always close to the coverage of the Foreign Office. If you see even statements issued by the Foreign Office and the language they use, compare it with the BBC, it's almost identical. But I noticed over the last few years, even before the ongoing genocide, the BBC started to drift more into this blunt bias towards Israel. Over the last, I mean, before 5 years, I think the BBC was a little bit trying to be shy on how to present both narratives, but now they're very blunt in their bias towards Israel. There's a lot of things that we could do to mitigate and to challenge this. And I think we could discuss it further as we go ahead through this discussion.
Thanks, Sameh. I mean, you talked about the role of journalists, and I remember was the most celebrated journalist who was treated abominably is, of course, Julian Assange, and he actually referred to some of the journalists as war criminals, actually, complicit in the war crimes, complicit in actually manufacturing consent, as you say, for intervention in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and so on. I mean, he said, if war can be started by lies, then peace can be started by truth. Why do you think the journalists are so complicit? I mean, journalism should be an honourable profession. I think you are an honourable person, an honourable journalist. You sort of, uphold the tradition of what, journalism should be about. Sameh, why is it, do you think, that journalists are so dreadful, and particularly in relation to the question of Israel and Palestine?
Percent of world media, in general. So the issue here, if we have journalists who are not careerists, then you would start to have this really real journalism. But in this case, in the UK, I don't see real journalism here. I don't see it. And just name me one. Maybe there are like a few journalists who are able to speak out, but the outlets wouldn't allow them. I mean, if somebody in the BBC would speak and say something now out that would upset the Israeli lobby, you would have this organization that I mentioned, the Israel organization, complaining to the editorial boards within the BBC or the editors. Then the editors would curb and would speak to that journalist and would not allow such stories. So the issue is not only journalists, but also the outlets. So the ownership for private outlets is one thing, but the state-owned media is another thing. And I always say the BBC is a state-owned media, although like I was challenged many times now, the BBC is independent, etc. But it's not independent, despite, it's some sort of independency here or there. It's still, the taxpayers pay this annual fee for it. And as far as the government is working to get this money for the BBC is still not independent, and that's why we have this bias. And the BBC's narrative, is always, as I said, in line of what the establishment want. Anyone can compare, the press releases of the Foreign Office with the coverage of the BBC. You will see no difference. It's almost the same in terms of this bias. And having studied even the American side as well, where we've seen how the Israel lobby established organizations there to even cast doubt on the Palestinian narrative. Even all the videos you see these days, you'll see comments on the media saying this is Pallywood, like Hollywood, which is all lies. So even we're being the victims here, we're being attacked, we're being under this genocide, and they're trying to spread this sort of cynicism and doubt that we are not the victims, that we are lying, that we are fabricating this. This is almost what the Israel lobby is doing these days. And as far as journalism is concerned, if we don't stand up here and as alternative media outlets, or as I would say advocacy groups, to expose those, I would say, journalists. And I always, have a strategy in my work, which is name and shame. And when October the 7th took place, and after that, a few weeks, I saw the bias within the Times, the Mirror, and the total negligence of the Palestinian stories, I started to name and shame politicians as well as journalists who were ignoring the Palestinian side of the story, who were not even considering the Palestinians as victims, and most of the times were considering the Israelis as victims. They don't even come to see who was killed there. We're not even numbers for them. Just numbers. 500 Palestinians were killed, 600. They don't even mention, some sort of backgrounds. And, background in journalism and context is a key. And I don't see this when there's an attack against the Israelis in the West Bank here or there, you will see some sort of context for the previous attacks and etc. But when it comes to their attacks, the settlers attacks, or what's happening in the Gaza Strip, you don't see context. You don't see background, and it's a key for any journalist to have a background and context. And context is a key, but it's being ignored by those outlets. So, in my view, I don't see real journalism in the UK. The journalism in its worst, time here. You've got this Talk TV now. You got GB News and those crazy shows that I've never imagined such crazy media outlets and journalists to be now in the forefront of the media outlets in the UK. And I think the IFJ, the International Union of Journalists, should move, to curb into these outlets. They should not even be affiliated to International Union of Journalists or federations. Even the NUJ in this country should take an action against those journalists.
Yeah, I mean, they bring shame on the whole kind of notion of journalism. But do you tell me? Do you think it's just down to careerism then that the corporate journalists are so bad? Is that it? They just want to protect their career like the politicians?
Yeah, it's the flack. This is the element. We got the flack that is mentioned by manufacturing consent of Noam Chomsky's book. Okay, and it's here. It's the self-censorship that is being adopted by journalists because of the Israel lobby attacks. If the Israel lobby is attacking all the time, attacking you, if you are not a principled, politician or journalist, and we know it here, it's like, look at the Labour politicians these days. All of them are like this. They are they're not loyal to the idea of being, part of this democracy to serve their constituents as politicians, let alone also journalists who are not loyal to the fact that journalism require, this free press, or context, balance, accuracy, objectivity, impartiality. They're not. They're not adopting to this. And part of them are lobbied. They've been lobbied for many years, working even for the Israel lobby. Many journalists are embedded, in my view, by Israeli intelligence and Mossad in this country. I don't rule out, even if they can consider me as a conspiracy theorist, but it's a fact here. Look at those small media outlets that are run by Israelis here, who are trying to create this flack factor to pressure journalists, editors, and media outlets who are trying to speak out. So those journalists who are not really adhering to the facts are just avoiding being real journalists here. And I think, as I said earlier, the UK's journalism in its worst time, and I think there got to be something here, maybe like some sort of advocacy for these international union of journalists to discredit those outlets. There should be some sort of a criteria created by us as the alternative politicians or media to expose this.
Yeah, no, absolutely. What I found rather curious, Sameh, was the fact that the Israeli media reported more accurately on the myths that were being peddled, the Zionist propaganda that was being peddled about, 40 babies being beheaded, babies being put in ovens on October the 7th, all these lurid atrocity propaganda, really, that was being peddled by the corporate media about the resistance operation on the 7th of October. How do you account for that? That the Israeli newspapers are providing a more accurate picture of the reality than the British media and the media in other European and the United States.
The rhetoric of anti-Semitism over the last 10 years, where we've seen the Israel lobby trying to enforce a certain, the definition of anti-Semitism, and the fact that they were trying to show and to demonstrate that, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, created this self-censorship within this sphere of media and journalism. As such, when you have such a story now in Israel being, debunked by Israeli media about these massacres on October the 7th, and many of these were reported as fake by the Israeli media. No one dares here to say the truth and to revisit what happened, to speak about it. So who is imposing the agenda here on these editorial boards? I don't know. And I wonder why this is happening. I still have, I still need answers for this. But my conclusion, over the last 10 years in this country, we have seen this rise of, of the issue of trying to enforce a certain anti-Semitism. So anyone trying to come close to such topics would think that if trying to, have doubts on such stories, maybe would be linked to having doubts on the Holocaust. That's why the journalists would avoid, speaking about such issues. Although the Israelis were, maybe Israeli media were like, I would say, courageous enough to debunk and denounce their own, army and the media and on those fake reports that were mentioned by I-24, which is an Israeli state TV, which was in minutes was adopted by the Times, by the Mirror, and all the outlets in this country.
Well, of course, Shulamit Aloni, that famous quote from 20 odd years ago when she was on Democracy Now! Being interviewed. I'm sure you've seen it, Sameh. It's been circulating around the internet for many years now. When she was asked a question about anti-Semitism, she said, "Oh, it's a trick. We always use it. Anti-Semitism and Holocaust denial is a trick that we use whenever Israel comes under attack or criticism from worldwide public opinion." But Sameh, just say a word to him. And obviously, you've had first-hand experience, as I was saying, of the brutality of the Israeli occupation forces. How do the Palestinian people keep going? I mean, their resilience, their tenacity is really inspirational, frankly.
We're very strong people. We're very steadfast. I've lived through the first Intifada. I've experienced firsthand, the first Intifada for many years. I've witnessed how the Israelis were storming into our homes, terrorizing us, scaring us, me, my family. I was wounded in the second Intifada. I was shot in my leg. And my friend was shot before my eyes, Shafiq al-Shawa in Briar Oslo, just a few weeks prior Oslo Accord. He was shot in the head. He was my schoolmate. We've seen a lot in our lives, I mean, even this, sometimes when I'm being attacked and criticized by Israel lobby in this country, I laugh, I'm that sort of guy. And I congratulate you on being the same, by the way, Chris, because I know what you've been through, even the Bristol University professor Miller, I think you've been through a lot like us, but you're still strong and steadfast here. So as people who live there, as people who saw all this horrifying, life, we're still strong. And I don't think the Israelis will be able to achieve anything in the Gaza Strip. People are coping now. I talked to many friends and family over there. They're coping with what's happening now. Yes, there's a genocide, but they're not willing to relocate or to escape to Egypt. And that's the plan of the Israelis as of now. This, famine and starvation, that is this man-made famine that is being doctored and engineered by the Israelis to push them towards Egypt would not succeed. Israelis are betting that, by creating these hardships for people, they would go and escape to Egypt, but it's not going to happen. Looking at my generation now living in the Gaza Strip, they have experienced the first Intifada, the second Intifada, the Intifada of the tunnel. They've experienced the almost more than 4 wars, plus a genocide, plus 17 or 18 years of siege. And they're still strong and steadfast. They would not just leave because this is our land. This is apart from the myth that Israel is trying to spread here or there about their original historical rights there. No, we will be there. We will never leave our land.
Well, I can say this, Sameh, you very kindly said that, and indeed put myself and David Miller in the same category as you, and I don't think we are, actually, and it's people like you, Sameh, that gives us the strength and the inspiration, really, to keep going in the way in which we do. And, I've always felt, and I've said this many times, that, when I was a member of Parliament, when you have a political platform, you have an obligation to stand up for what's right, to do the right thing. And regrettably, everybody else that I came across in Parliament when I was there it turns out that they put their career first. And I always used to say, if you treat your role as a member of parliament as a career or a job, you start making decisions based on what's good for your career, what's good for your job, as it were, and protecting that. And regrettably, that's the way they've operated. And this is where makes people like me and George Galloway, I suppose, very different from the rest of them. The thing is, we need to get more people like George Galloway and people like you, obviously, Sameh. I know you stood in the full Parliament last time. We need to get you on those green benches in Parliament so that we can really start making the desperate changes that are needed in this country. But before I bring Lowkey in as our final speaker, I just wonder if we could get maybe Tadgh back on the screen, just see whether Tadgh has got any comments or any response to what we've just heard from Sameh.
Yeah, well, it was an honor listening to Sameh there, and I think that puts it in perspective in terms of resilience, as you quite rightly said, Chris. Like I just see us, you and I, as kind of allies to this very, very righteous cause. And in terms of resilience, I've never experienced anything like it in my life from my Palestinian friends here in Ireland. It's beyond resilience. I don't have words for it. I think we don't have words for the scale of horror that's going on for Palestinians, and we actually also don't have the vocabulary to describe the resilience and the strength and the perseverance that they have. But the only other thing I wanted to add, something that I was going to say earlier, was, if you were looking for one example to sum up the media complicity, or complicity by omission, I think, as Sameh put it, or just abdication of responsibility. I was just considering again today the fact that when the ICJ case was happening and South Africa were putting its arguments across on that first day, and I remember I was driving home from a gig and I had Al Jazeera in the car, like the audio, I was listening to it, and I was so moved because the arguments were just so unequivocal, they were so powerful. And I just thought, this is such a wonderful opportunity for anybody who's on the fence, even people in my own life, family and friends, if they can just hear these arguments. They're so well put across, they're indubitable. And I remember thinking, this will be great now for the average punter at home in Ireland and in Britain and whatnot. And then I went home to realise that CNN and BBC and our own national broadcaster here never broadcast the first day. So they didn't broadcast, they chose not to broadcast South Africa's compelling arguments. They came in all right the second day when Israel was defending itself, but they didn't cover the first day of those arguments. And I think that, in a nutshell, covers up, illustrates exactly media complicity. They can't let those arguments be broadcast to the average punter, because then the average punter will realise, oh my God, we are all complicit in this horror. If our tax dollars are going in any way, tax dollars or pounds are going in any way to facilitate this mass murder. So I just thought that was a really good example to sum up just how, transparent and brazen the media have been in absolute bias on this so-called conflict, which isn't a conflict at all.
Absolutely, Tadgh. I think that one example, really, for those who still think that the BBC is a independent body, providing fearless journalism, the fact that they didn't cover that first day, I think, illustrates really the partial attitude that they take, particularly on this particular issue. But thank you, Tadgh, and thank you, Sameh, for your contributions. We're going to move now to Lowkey. We recorded Lowkey's contribution earlier, so he's not actually able to participate in the sort of discussion that we've just had with Tadgh and Sameh there. But we'll just pass the floor now to Lowkey and hear his contribution.
Thank you for having me today. It's great to be here for No2Nato to discuss these 365 days of genocide. Of course, October 7th was unprecedented in many ways, and it set in motion a domino effect, which I would say is causing this settler society to take suicidal steps towards the demise of the Zionist project. So, according to the Lancet Medical Journal, Israel's genocide in Gaza has caused the death of over 200,000 people. whether that's directly or indirectly. According to the health ministry in Gaza, you have over 40,000 people that have died, with many still trapped under rubble. Interestingly, what Israel has sought to do is really erase Palestine completely. But what has quite ironically that led to is Palestine being rendered ubiquitous in every country in the world. Any street that you go to in Bethnal Green, for example, where I was just today, you saw a Palestinian flag on every single corner. You have tens of millions of people who have mobilized across the world's capitals in support of Palestine. And in a way, by seeking to besiege the people of Gaza, Zionism has sort of besieged itself in a way. When you look at the Article 1 of the Genocide Convention, it charges those that are signatories to it to the obligation of intervening to prevent the commission or the incident of genocide. And so that humanitarian intervention really has taken place, led, of course, by Yemen and Lebanon. And you have seen the key Israeli port of Eilat completely bankrupt. And you've also seen the displacement of over 100,000 settlers from the north of occupied Palestine. We also know that the export of goods and services from Israel fell by 20%, and about 60,000 Israeli businesses are expected to go bust in 2024 due to the war. The Israeli GDP itself has in fact decreased by 20%. You've also seen the massive company Intel withdraw a $25 billion investment away from Israel. And while we know that Israel's power grid is reliant on coal from Colombia, Colombia has also stopped that. When you look at the key suppliers, South Africa and Russia, one of those states is actually prosecuting Israel in The Hague for the crime of genocide. So what you have is among the BRICS nations, varying levels of disdain with what Israel has done and support for the Palestinian cause. Of course, India really being the exceptional one in that it has directly assisted Israel in its campaign in Gaza. But you even have historians like Yuval Noah Harari, who is himself an Israeli and a Zionist, really predicting this period of time as the end of Zionism. So this is really unprecedented territory that we're stepping into. And the key to it is Israel's maximalist and fantastical ambitions. What Israel is attempting to do in Gaza, beyond all of the PR and the propaganda, it is attempting to move the Palestinians there out and into Egypt. It also is making movements to cause a situation in the West Bank where Palestinians will also be driven from there. Israel is also seeking to occupy Lebanon, which will lead to, or at least parts of the south, which will no doubt lead to a long war of attrition. What Israel fails to realize is you do not win a war by simply killing the most vulnerable in the population. You actually win the war by convincing the largest number of people of your viewpoint. And that's something that Israel has decidedly lost, whether that's in Gaza or in Lebanon, in elsewhere. And now Israel is threatening action against Iran. And the real question is, will these outlandish and maximalist and fantastical aims be realized, and can they be realized? You're seeing really the death of the quote-unquote international order, whereby people would gesture towards international law as somehow a guide in what they are doing. But no one needs to respect international law anymore, because the United States and Israel clearly do not. They have burnt it. When you even look at the policies that Israel has taken vis-a-vis Lebanon, Is it now to be normalized that people will be able to insinuate themselves directly into the supply chain and plant explosives in objects that are later used and explode either randomly or with the aim of hurting people from particular groups? All of these things Israel has done and is really acting in ways that we have not seen before. And the truth, I guess, is that the United States has given it a completely blank check to do what it wants, and mass murder is ultimately the essence of Zionism. Historically, Israel is believed to have carried out assassinations in at least 18 states, from Italy to Cyprus, to France, to Greece, Norway, Germany, the UAE, Egypt, Jordan, Uruguay, Lebanon, Brazil, Tunisia, Belgium, Malta, Malaysia, Syria, and Iran. And, this is just the tip of the iceberg. More children were killed in Gaza in 4 months than in 4 years of worldwide wars. Over 1,000 in Lebanon were killed in 1 week, for example. And, Israel is literally just setting itself up for isolation going forward. In a way, the region is now split between the axis of resistance and the axis of assistance. And the axis of resistance is in a constant state of war with Israel and facing the consequences for standing with and supporting Gaza. But the axis of assistance is more insidious, and people should really keep an eye on what it's doing, because you have Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and Jordan working together to provide a land bridge to circumvent the Yemeni blockade of the Red Sea, to directly support Israel by exporting to it. You also have those states like the UAE, for example, through its state-owned arms organization, arms company, the Edge Group, directly invested in an Israeli company that manages quote-unquote Israeli airspace, Highlander Aviation. When you look at the UAE and Saudi Arabia, they've both invested massively into this Affinity Group, Affinity Partners, which is an investment firm owned by Jared Kushner, but again, funded with Saudi and UAE money. Now, that money has been invested in, number one, Israel's largest vehicle manufacturer, Shlomo Group, which also builds the ships for the Israeli Navy, and also the Affinity Partners has invested in one of the top shareholders in Elbit Systems. So what we're talking about is Gulf money going directly into Israeli military infrastructure and helping it in its campaign to subjugate Gaza and subjugate Lebanon. But the long-term plan, and it's important that we're clear about what Israel's objectives in the region will be. Number one, it's depopulating Gaza. It's also depopulating the West Bank. It's also replacing Al-Aqsa with what they call the Solomon's Temple. But then in addition to that, what they want to do is change the culture within particularly Lebanon, Yemen, probably Iraq and Syria too. So they want to, in the case of Lebanon, get rid of Hezbollah and also commandeer the curriculum against the population. So apply really the UAE model onto Lebanon, and they will seek the UAE and Saudi to help them in that projection of power, and they will seek to do that in other places in the region too, in order to work generationally on producing people who are not bonded and wedded to the Palestinians. So that's really the long-term aims of Israel with this, but it will require permanent war and a war of attrition. So unfortunately, we've been through seriously dark days throughout this year, but it seems, are entering into darker days. So I hope that everyone watching this can do what they can to prepare in this country to escalate as much as possible in support of not only the Palestinian people, but also the people of Lebanon in this horrific war. Thank you very much for having me.
Well, that was Lowkey, and I want to thank him for another inspirational contribution. Let me also thank Sameh Habeeb, the British Palestinian journalist who contributed to tonight's discussion, and of course Tadgh Hickey, who also made a very telling contribution, I think, this evening. I hope you've enjoyed, if that's the right expression, the discussion that we've had tonight. I hope it's inspired you to pick up the cudgels and take up the cause for the Palestinian people and against the Zionist entity that is involved in such horrors that we thought would never ever return to the world, but sadly it is, and these war crimes, these atrocities are being perpetrated on a daily basis, and we need to continuing holding our politicians and our media to account in order to put pressure on them to at least stop the arms sales to Israel. It's outrageous that Britain is still selling arms to Israel to commit a genocide in Gaza, to kill and maim tens of thousands of Palestinian people. We know that they've suspended the licenses for a handful of export licenses to Israel for arms sales to Israel, but this is just performative. It should be entirely stopped, and we need to be demanding more than that. I mean, the reality is we want to see a ceasefire, we want to see an end to the arms sales, and we want to isolate Israel. There should be a complete trade embargo, and Israel should be completely isolated from the civilized world. And so that must be our mission. We must redouble our efforts to achieve that goal. And I'm sure with the level of support that we're seeing, which is growing all the time in the country and around the world, that we will in the end prevail. As Martin Luther King once said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but in the end it bends towards justice, and we need to secure justice for the Palestinian people. So thanks for watching, and hopefully you'll join us again at the next broadcast of No2Nato.